Hi folks, welcome again to another video lecture. Today we're going to be tackling a huge topic and the one that's been in the news quite a bit recently. We're going to be talking a little bit about Korea and Vietnam and some of the current issues that face this particular part of Asia. And we'll do this kind of in a context of two topics that hopefully you guys are familiar with from your American history classes. We're going to bring up a little bit of the Vietnam War, we're going to bring up a little of the Korean conflict, and we're going to loop this in with some of the past, but also some of the more current history that's been involved in these particular parts of the world. So why don't we start with kind of a quick introduction to both of these conflicts just to kind of refresh you as to where you probably left off with your US2 teachers. The Korean conflict, this takes place in the 1950s. It's often referred to as the Forgotten War. This was a UN action. Not necessarily America taking the forefront, it was the United Nations, but we definitely played a huge role here. And this was basically to counteract a North Korean invasion of the South. And also within this, you have the context of the Cold War. So obviously we'll be referring to that. The Vietnam War, also very similar, but in this case, America taking more of the lead here. Once again, we have a communist North and a non-communist South. A non-communist South that was very much propped up by the US government in many ways. And this is a conflict that eventually brings about kind of modern day communist Vietnam. And so again, it's within the context of the Cold War, so we'll be bringing up some of your US2 American history as we go. So why don't we start with Korea? And the Korean conflict is one that's rooted in sort of the history of how North and South Korea were founded, but also a lot of the current stuff you see in the news about missile testing and nuclear ambitions and kind of the current leadership structure in North Korea also has to do with the after effects of the conflict. So we'll look at the conflict a little bit, but we'll also look at some of that past and present history as well. So why don't we start with the past history? For centuries, Korea has been a focus of invasion. For many years, through the 1300s and 1400s, it was a place that was invaded oftentimes by Imperial China. And again, this is an area of the world that's very rich in resources. The North has a lot of minerals. The South has really good farmland. In the 19th and 20th century, we see Japan kind of take over as the imperialistic power here. And for much of the 20th century, Korea is a Principality of Japan, a colony of Japan, as they begin their imperial ambitions and take us into kind of the Second World War. We're not going to focus too much on Korea during World War II, obviously, but I will just bring up kind of one aspect that usually is left out, which is the discussion of comfort women. The comfort women are kind of this very sad chapter in Korean history where you have women who are basically taken as sex slaves, as servants, by the Japanese government, by the Japanese military. Some of them are going to be taken back to Japan after the war and kept on as servants, as mistresses. And there is a small population of Koreans in Japan today, which is kind of interesting. Most of us think of Japan as being a very homogeneous society, but there is a small population of Japanese Koreans there, and they are very much looked down upon because they are the byproduct of this very kind of negative moment in Japanese history. Probably the most famous, I could say, American associated with this is, for any of you guys who are Pittsburgh Steelers fans, you probably recognize Hines Ward. His father was a serviceman who served in the Korean War, was stationed in Japan, then went to Korea, has a child with his Korean girlfriend, and that becomes Hines Ward. So kind of an interesting twist there. He has often traveled to Japan and Korea to speak on kind of his experiences as a Korean American, as a byproduct of this conflict, and so he provides kind of an interesting voice in this conversation. So as you probably remember from your American history classes, after World War II is over, Korea is going to be divided along the 38th parallel. Allies to the north occupy, allies to the south occupy. In the north, it's the Soviet Union. In the south, it's the United States. So this is old review history that I'm sure you guys are familiar with. In the north, the Soviets are going to institute a program of a buffer state or a satellite state. They're going to bring about a pro-Soviet government. They're going to institute kind of Soviet socialist reforms. And they're also going to institute in the new government this desire for unity. And particularly they want unity under their version of government, not so much what the South is offering. The man they picked to lead this new country is a guy that they have a very close relationship from through World War II, which is Kim Il-sung. Sung was a communist revolutionary. He had fought with the Soviets in World War II. And basically, once he gets in power, he starts to develop a cult of personality, a totalitarian state, very similar to what we studied with the Soviet Union and Communist China. So Kim Il-sung is the first of three leaders that we're going to look at with North Korea. He is the originator. He rules up until his death in 1994, and he really develops kind of the cult of personality that North Korea continues to see today. His body is going to be memorialized and put on display just like all the other communist guys that we've talked about. And he obviously has this mega statue that now has been joined by a statue of his son, Kim Jong-il. We'll talk about him in a moment. But Kim Il-sung is also responsible for initiating what's known as the junta policy, which is a policy of self-reliance, this idea that North Korea does not need the rest of the world. They are self-sufficient. So that's also playing into the current policy of North Korea being very isolationist and very kind of like standoffish from the rest of the world. Now in the South, we get a very different government. This is going to be a pro-American government. We're going to have democratic reforms, industrialization and modernization. And the gentleman that we pick as the United States to run this new country is Syngman Rhee. He is another resistance fighter, fought the Japanese, had been an American ally during the war, but he was also a very strong anti-communist. While he is a guy that the United States backs, he does have a little bit of a black stain on his record. He is a pro-military leader, and oftentimes he backs up his rule with some pro-military tactics that are kind of in a way dictatorial. So that's going to be something that sets a trend that South Korea unfortunately has to kind of live with for the next half century. With, when the public starts to protest, when they start to exercise some of those democratic reforms, the military usually will step in and try to clamp down a little bit on it. So keeping with a trend that we see a lot in the Cold War. And Rhee, like I said, he's going to be the president of South Korea for much of his kind of political life. Eventually, upon his death, we're going to see new leaders come in, and obviously he plays a role in the Korean War as well as our staunch ally, our anti-communist ally. Through the help of American loans and American industry, South Korea is going to develop an amazing economy, agriculture at first, but then industrialized. It's known as one of the 6 tiger economies of Asia. And so to have this amazing story is something that America kind of holds up as a great success story. And obviously, if you look at a lot of the products you buy from electronics, clothing, different types of things like that, you'll see a lot of times made in South Korea. They're an incredibly prosperous economy, even though they've run on some hard times recently. Now, within the context of the Cold War, and I love this image of Kim Il-sung giving a speech in front of the picture of Stalin. Stalin is going to encourage Kim Il-sung to reunite the peninsula. They're a friendly satellite state. There's also a form of a psychological victory that Stalin wants to get here over the West. So they're going to really beef up the North Korean military with weapons supplies. And this leads to kind of a new policy that North Korea continues to follow, which is the Shogun policy. It's nothing to do with the Japanese leaders that we talked about in Unit 1, but the Shogun policy basically means military first. And so any resources, food, electricity, anything like that goes first to the military, and then whatever's left over is dispensed through the state to the rest of the population. And obviously, this leads to massive famines. It leads to incredible heartache among the civilian population. But it guarantees that North Korea is always going to have a million-man army. They're always going to have this mega force ready to fight, ready to, fight and die for their leader. And so this kind of sets us up for what becomes the Korean War. So we'll just go over a little of the history of the conflict here very fast. Sets off the conflict. 1949, there are promised elections of unification. Those elections never happen. When those elections don't happen, the USSR and China are going to encourage Kim Il-sung to invade. And in 1950, North Korea invades. The UN jumps in to aid South Korea, and we have an expeditionary force that's led by the US that's going to go there as part of the quote-unquote police action. The first half of the war does not go well. The North Koreans capture Seoul. They win a number of victories. The UN is going to be pushed back to the city of Busan, which is at the southernmost tip of the peninsula. And it really looks like this is the end of democracy on the Korean peninsula. What kind of turns the tide is General Douglas MacArthur, and a very courageous, very big gamble he takes, landing American forces at Incheon. And this begins the UN counterattack. So we know that the fighting goes very badly in the initial phases for the South Koreans and the UN. When the UN does jump in, there's this mobilization of sorts, this effort to try to get involved in the war, but also make this a war about defending democracy and protecting fellow democratic countries from communism. And you can see here the UN forces arriving to help out in Busan. MacArthur kind of turns the tide with his attack on Incheon. And this is one of the last big amphibious landings in American history, kind of World War II Normandy style. And Incheon goes very well. The North Koreans are not expecting it. They're completely taken by surprise. And of course, this leads to a resounding victory on the part of the UN forces. So the war turns a little bit here, and eventually we're going to get to a stalemate. MacArthur decides to take the fight to the North Koreans. He invades North Korea, pushes the North Koreans all the way to the Yalu River, which is the river that divides China from North Korea. And it's at this point that we see the war take another turn. MacArthur wants not to invade China, but he does want to bomb strategic sites, bridges, power plants that are on the Chinese side of the river. And when President Truman refuses to do this, we see China kind of jump into the war and start to push the UN back. So we get through the 38th parallel. An interesting little side note here is during this initial invasion, we do have an E-Town resident that was included in this. Some of you guys may know the story of Robert Ream, who was an E-Town graduate in 1943. He is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for the battle he fights at the Chuzan Reservoir, which has actually been, the campaign itself has been memorialized in a recent PBS American Experience film, which is really good, and I would encourage it. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He throws his body on a grenade, thus saving his platoon. So kind of an interesting little side note there. The Americans push all the way to the Yalu River, and that's when the Chinese counterattack, and their massive numbers and swarm tactics force the UN back across the 38th parallel. So why did China get involved? Well, Mao's a little worried that the UN forces are so close to his border. He's worried that they're going to invade China next. And also there is a little bit of hesitation on the part of Stalin to widen this up a little bit. If the USSR jumps in there, there could be a wider war. So China decides to jump in knowing that the United States is not going to necessarily view it the same way. So their swarm tactics are pretty effective. Their massive numbers neutralize what they lack in technology. So the war comes to an end, so to speak, even though technically we don't have a peace treaty, in 1953 with basically a stalemate being declared. Both Koreas signed an armistice, and that's kind of where we've been sitting ever since. That armistice is still in effect. There has not been a peace treaty, and the border remains known as a demilitarized zone, a DMZ. So both countries remain on a heavy state of alert. So the UN retreats. We have kind of a period of trench warfare. This is when President Eisenhower pays a visit, as part of his campaign for president, get us out of Korea. And then we have the signing of the armistice, which takes place, which is also kind of the current document that covers, the current goings-on in Korea today. So the DMZ itself remains kind of one of the longest continuously controlled borders by the military in the world. Checkpoints, barbed wire, minefields, the whole 9 yards. And the place that most people think of when they think of the DMZ is the Joint Security Area. This was an area that was set aside by the UN to have peace talks between the two Koreas, though they don't usually happen. Probably one of the tensest places in the world. Each side kind of outdoing each other, out-mustering each other, trying to have guards that can intimidate and whatnot. And it's constant watching, constant watching. You'll see the inside of one of those joint security areas here. So it is very much kind of the tension point for Korea today when it comes to a lot of what goes on the peninsula. We can mention a few other kind of side notes, some dust-ups that we've had over the years. There has always been the issue of defectors. Some of you guys may know the story of James Darznak, who was an American serviceman, probably the most famous, who defected to North Korea across the DMZ. He's been a regular feature of propaganda films, marries a North Korean woman, has children there, is a full participant and supporter of the North Korean regime. And there was an interesting documentary called Behind the Line that was made about his life by the North Koreans, and it's very interesting hearing what he has to say about life in this very kind of misunderstood country, kind of unknown country, if you want to call it that. We have the instance of the USS Pueblo, which was a U.S. surveillance ship that was taken. That is actually now on public display. As you can see in the picture there, it's a museum to American imperialism, which is interesting in and of itself. There have been nationalist abductions. In the 1970s, the Japanese found that a number of their citizens were abducted and taken to North Korea. And even today, some of the families cannot get access to their loved ones who remain in North Korea. Their fate kind of a bit of a mystery. And there's also the discussion of American and UN dead that are still in North Korea. As the battles rage, the U.S. military is burying their dead, and American families have no access to these graves. They have no way to get the bodies back for reinterment, so that remains an ongoing struggle in Korea as well, kind of a residual of the war. Obviously, we can talk about the humanitarian disasters there, the famines, the complete disregard the North Korean government seems to have for its own people, and just the way that different international organizations have tried to influence this over the years. For the South, we could talk about the April 19th revolution, which was basically a rising up against Syngman Rhee's presidency, and this is going to institute basically, after he leaves the stage, a series of elected presidents, but they're always going to have the same instance, which is a military edge to them. And this begins, once again, kind of a pattern that we see during the Cold War of the U.S., even though we know that some of these guys are just as bad as the communist dictators that we're fighting against. We support them because they are staunch anti-communists. 1980, with what's known as the Gudan Uprising, kind of brings an end to this because of one of the activists that's taken during these street protests and arrested by the military is this guy Park Jong-chul, who is tortured and his body discarded on the side of the road by the South Korean police. And this really galvanizes not only the political establishment, but also the social establishment to really push for a return to democratic values. And we see that in 1987 with the first kind of completely open elections held in South Korea, where now we can officially say that there is an element of popular democracy there, at least since the late 1980s. 1994, Kim Il-sung dies. Power passes to his son, Kim Jong-il, who rules until his death in 2011. During Kim Jong-il's period, there's some interesting developments. We have the Sunshine Period from about 1998 and about 10 years of kind of warming relations. We allow families to kind of see each other. There's some economic trade and development. It seems like things are going right. The president of South Korea at the time is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, so that's a great accomplishment. But we also have dark spots here. This is when the North Korean nuclear program begins under Kim Jong-il. We have the sinking of a a South Korean battleship, and the North Koreans being blamed for it, but never really any realization or acknowledgement of responsibility here. And then in 2011, Kim Jong-il dies, and power then passes to his third son, his third oldest son, Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un is still very much an unknown to us. We know very little about his background. We know very little about his ambitions. But what we do know, he has intensified North Korea's space program. We know that he is a huge fan of basketball, so you've probably heard about the visits from Dennis Rodman and the Harlem Globetrotters, which is kind of odd in and of itself, kind of add to the odyssey of this story. The cyber attacks that followed the release of the movie The Interview in 2014 have kind of been equated to him. And obviously, if you've been keeping up with the news, the discussions of the continued missile tests and the desire of North Korea to have a nuclear weapon continues. We really don't know a whole lot about North Korea particularly because there's not a lot of intelligence for us to go on. It's kind of an intelligence black hole. The U.S. has no diplomatic relationship with North Korea, and we probably won't. When American citizens are in trouble there, we work through either the Chinese or in some cases the Swedes who have an embassy in Pyongyang. So it's a very complicated situation based on history and based on current international law. So to kind of wrap up the Korea portion of our presentation to date, negotiations keep going. There's a lot of mistrust, a lot of fear and hostility. And for the United States' part, we have about 28,000 American troops still on the border. And our major negotiator in the region, we rely on China to kind of help out here, which is also a complicated relationship in and of itself, as you guys have seen from past video lectures. Let's move over to the Vietnam portion of our lesson today. And obviously, we've talked a little bit about this conflict in passing. You guys have probably talked about it in your American history classes from the U.S. perspective. Very controversial conflict, but we'll also try to bring in a little bit of the history from the Vietnamese side. So what kind of kicks off this conflict? For most of the 19th century, Vietnam is a colony of the French. And during World War II, when the Japanese invade, the Vietnamese, particularly a resistance group known as the Viet Minh, rises up against the Japanese, and they fight on the side of the Allies. They receive U.S. and Soviet support in that fight. And the hope is here that they will receive independence when the war is over. Dream of a lot of former colonial possessions during the course of World War II. Now, leading the Viet Minh is a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. you guys may know a little bit about this gentleman. Ho Chi Minh is a peasant, but he is also a very staunch Marxist revolutionary, very active in the Vietnamese independence movement, and later he's going to become one of the first leaders of North Vietnam. So he has a very interesting history in that, even back as far as 1919, 1920, Ho Chi Minh was advocating for Vietnamese independence. Here he is at the Versailles Conference, basically arguing on behalf of the Vietnamese people for independence. Unfortunately, didn't get it. But part of the reason for that probably is also the fact that he is a follower of Marx. He was not shy in expressing his devotion towards what was going on in the Soviet Union and Vladimir Lenin. So that probably turned off some of the Allied powers there. Within this conflict, we are going to see when World War II ends, the French try to reestablish their hold in Vietnam, and the Viet Minh are going to go from fighting the Japanese to now fighting the French. Now, I'll try to refrain from making French jokes here, but eventually the French are going to be defeated in 1954. Even with massive aid from the United States, they're going to be defeated at a place called Bien Bien Phu. And Bien Bien Phu is one of the great examples of why you should always take geography into account when you're fighting a battle. And I'll just kind of show a couple images here to illustrate that. Here is the valley of Bien Bien Phu, and the French have a military base in that valley. They're airdropping supplies and men and weaponry there, but the Viet Minh control the hills. And so the Viet Minh can pretty much fire down on the French at will. They have no way out of this valley. They're pretty much stuck, and eventually the French are going to be forced to surrender their main expeditionary force in Vietnam. And this brings about a humiliating defeat, and the French decide we're going to cut our losses and get out of here. So the Vietnamese planting their flag victoriously on the bunkers at Bien Bien Phu, and then the French prisoners now being escorted out to be sent back to France once peace is declared. So this takes us to why Vietnam is a divided country. Vietnam is going to be divided similarly to what we saw in Korea. A temporary UN boundary is going to be set up along the 17th parallel. In the north, we're going to have a mostly communist government set up by Ho Chi Minh. In the south, we're going to have an American kind of backed democratic government. And there is going to be elections in 1955 to decide which government will unite the country. Now, in the north, I mentioned Ho Chi Minh. He institutes Marxist reforms, and he also starts the process, which is going to continue throughout the war itself, of supplying communist sympathizers in the South to try to prop up support for these popular elections. Those groups eventually are going to militarize, and they're going to become known as the Viet Cong. So when Ho Chi Minh eventually passes away in 1969, his body is put on display, and, you get it. Communist countries, they like to keep their leaders around, their founders around. The Viet Cong, communist sympathizers in the South, their goal is to reunite Vietnam through force. And they're willing to use guerrilla tactics, what we might call terrorist tactics, hit-or-run tactics against the South Vietnamese and later the Americans. And they are directly supplied by the North Koreans, the North Vietnamese, through a series of trade routes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You've probably learned about that in your American history classes. Now in the South, we get No Dum Diem. And Diem is, once again, much like Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist, but he really doesn't fit in with the population of the new country he's going to be running. He is Western educated. He considers himself more European than he does Vietnamese. He's converted to Catholicism, and he is a strong-armed leader backed by the military. So while he is our guy, we support him 100%. The people of South Vietnam don't really see it all that way. Many South Vietnamese are critical of Diem, his secret police, his corrupt nature, his dictatorial methods. And you are going to see a number of groups protest him, even though most of these groups are going to face discrimination as a result, but also the U.S. kind of turns a blind eye to this as well. The great example of this is the Buddhist minority, or I should say majority in Vietnam. The Buddhist monks who are in the minority, they're going to be sort of the forefront of this peaceful resistance. Probably the most famous image of this is a monk in Saigon, what becomes Ho Chi Minh City, lighting himself on fire as a symbolic protest against Diem's rule. Now, a few weeks before the Kennedy assassination in 1963, President Kennedy gives the order to the CIA to execute Diem because he feels like Diem has, kind of outlived his usefulness. This is where the conspiracy theory of did the CIA kill Kennedy kind of gets its start. The CIA liked Diem, he was their boy, so they're gonna back him, and when he goes, well, we have to get rid of Kennedy. So as we move into the 1960s, American involvement in Vietnam gets more overt. America follows a policy of containment, which I know you guys probably already know from your American history classes. The fear is that will create a domino effect. If Vietnam falls, Laos, Cambodia, India, Burma, all these countries will become communist. And there is some evidence to back that up, but President Lyndon Johnson really buys into this, and he doesn't have a very high opinion of the North Vietnamese or of the enemies of America and the Soviet Union. There's a great story of him with showing off his scars. Here he is showing off his gallbladder scar and basically mocking the Ho Chi Minh, saying I have scars. Does Ho Chi Minh have one of these? And it's classic Texas politics here. But Lyndon Johnson is going to be the guy that intensifies America's involvement in the Vietnam War. So throughout the 50s and into the 1960s, we spend advisors, the Green Berets in. Eventually, by the time we get to the mid-60s, 1965, we have combat troops that drop in there. And by 1969, we have over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. So the Seek and Destroy missions, once again, we'll mention E-Town's other Medal of Honor recipient who served in the Vietnam War, Sergeant William Port, also kind of a transplant here, worked at the Klein chocolate factory and eventually loses his life in Vietnam, taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese after kind of defending his platoon and allowing the wounded to get out. So we'll kind of mention him in here as well. The Huey is a big part of this because we're dealing with jungle environments. That becomes essential. So why was the U.S. unsuccessful? There's a number of reasons. We incredibly underestimate the tenacity of the North Vietnamese to fight this war. The political commitments of the U.S. government here are openly talked about. It's a very unpopular war, and we never really got a handle on the cultural element of Vietnam. So our costs quickly skyrocket. And obviously, if you take a U.S. history class in college, you're going to delve a lot deeper into these than what I'm going through. But the inability to really cultivate the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, the inability to kind of stop the corrupt nature. This is a photograph of a Viet Cong soldier being executed, or a suspected Viet Cong soldier being executed by a South Vietnamese security official, and there is no due process here. It's basically traitor execution, and that was something again that runs kind of counter to our American values. But the U.S. did not really step in. Some of you guys may know about the use of new weapons like napalm, which has humanitarian issues with it. This being the photograph of Napalm Girl, her clothes literally burned off of her by the Jello gasoline that was used in the making of napalm. We can talk about Agent Orange and the effects of that upon the drinking water and the environmental situation. The My Lai massacre is always a focal point. The creation of prison camps and the discussion there. All of this kind of leads to a very toxic mix when it comes to U.S. policy towards Vietnam. So U.S. withdrawal in 1973. Last U.S. forces leave Vietnam. We are left with 58,000 Americans dead from this conflict. Within the next 2 years, South Vietnam is going to be a shell of its former self, and the North Vietnamese basically just steamroll. Americans get out, they evacuate. We have Operation Baby Lift, which gets all these kind of American Vietnamese children that were fathered by servicemen and kind of kept in the South. We get them out. 1975, the North Vietnamese roll into the presidential palace, and we have that iconic photograph of folks escaping on that last copter. This was reserved for the U.S. ambassador, so those folks, unfortunately, on the ladder are not getting out. They're going to become subjects of the North Vietnamese regime. So Vietnam today, still a communist country, massive economic issues. They've never been really to move past their agrarian roots, and the question of human rights often comes up. Since the 1980s, relationships between the U.S. and Vietnam have steadily improved. Through the 70s, we had an embargo on Vietnam, but that embargo has since gone. Trade has increased, worked together to try to get unexploded ordnances and missing U.S. servicemen home, have formed a bit of a partnership with the North Vietnamese, and this continues to be an issue, accounting for all the missing servicemen that are out there, accounting for all the unexploded ordnance. Recently, we saw President Obama, towards the end of his second term, go to Vietnam for a large international conference and talk about the continued support of the U.S. towards healing the wounds of this conflict. But obviously, it's something that's going to take a little bit more practice and a little bit more work to fully achieve. So again, this is a quick overview. We hope you enjoyed it, and obviously if you have questions, let me know. Other than that, guys, we will see you next time.